another episode of Right on Korea. I am your host, Fooch. A couple of things before we begin. Hopefully the sound is sounding a lot better. I finally bought a cord for this microphone, so we're using the nicer mic now, so hopefully that's making a world of difference. And I was able to figure out how to upload episodes to Spotify. It was quite easy, actually. So if you prefer listening to this episode, listening only, you can find it on Spotify. Just search Right on Korea. Now, with that being said, let's move on to today's episode, which is about the Halloween crowd crush disaster that occurred 2 years ago. This video should be uploaded on July 29th, Korean time, which is the second anniversary of that incident. Now, when I speak to some friends spitballing ideas about what content to create, I mentioned that I was going to make an episode about the Halloween incident that happened 2 years ago. And they said, why are you doing that? Nobody really cares about it anymore. It's old news. And I figured that is kind of sad, considering that we shouldn't forget these things. Of course, the family members and people who witnessed it and people who were there remember, but the country as a whole and maybe the world as a whole should remember this incident. But I also wanted to talk about it because I felt that no one really understood what the real problem was. No one really talked about how this could happen. At least definitely not in English. There are documentaries that are, I think Paramount made a documentary called Crush. I haven't seen it, but there are plenty of YouTube videos and documentaries that go into the details of the event. There are the tragedy porn channels and podcasts that go into all the victims and their names and what they were doing right before, and how tragic, and their family, and who were they speaking to moments before. This episode is not going to cover any of that. This episode is going to cover what I believe is the real issue behind the Halloween disaster, what really caused it, because a lot of people, I feel, are missing the forest for the trees. So I guess I should give a brief disclosure before we get into this, but if anyone gets upset or what, this is not a trigger warning, God no. Anyone listening that feels like I'm trying to make a statement about Korea or trying to say that, I think the US or Western countries are better than Korea because of X, Y, and Z. I'm not doing that. Every country has their own problem. I live in Korea. I feel like I've spoken to people about this tragedy. I understand a lot of the culture. So this is just pointing out what I experience on a day-to-day basis about the culture, and also highlighting things that I think have caused it. So let's jump in and talk a little bit about what this thing was to begin with. So for those of you who have never been to Korea, Itaewon is considered the foreigner area. Now, you can think of it kind of like a Koreatown or a Chinatown or Little Italy, whatever, except Korea doesn't have a lot of foreigners. It's, a small, just a couple of percent, half of which are Chinese, so there are Chinatowns, but specifically in Seoul, there's an area called Itaewon, which is kind of known as the foreigner area, and the reason for that is it's right next to where the US military base used to be. It has since moved out. So considering that this area was next to the military base, there were a lot of businesses that catered to the soldiers. So there would be Western food, Western bars, Western clubs. there would be fat people stores because, Koreans are getting fatter now, but originally Koreans were not that fat. So they had if you were a big Korean back then, you'd have to come to Itaewon to get clothes that would fit. So, and because there were businesses that catered to Westerners, it also attracted the non-US military Westerners that happened to be in Seoul that either wanted to try some sort of, some cuisine or wanted to partake in the nightlife. But back then I'm talking about up until about 12 to 15 years ago, most of the people that went to Itaewon were foreigners and the Koreans that were working there and some Koreans that wanted to experience that Western culture, which is why to this day, Koreans still say Itaewon is, the foreign area. It's not, but we'll get into that in a moment. So Halloween is not traditionally celebrated in Korea, right? So every Halloween, the foreigners that would come out to party in Itaewon, the western areas, would come out and some of them would wear a costume. And, some Koreans would come by to, try to take a look at the festivities and partake a little bit. But it was never an event. There's no event. And two, there wasn't that many people. I guess I should also kind of set up the area that Itaewon is not a very big, wide area. Essentially, you come out of the subway station, and it's only about 2 lanes of traffic both ways, so a total of 4 lanes of traffic. But a lot of this stuff occurs in what I call the back alley. Now, the back alley is parallel to the main street, which has the subway station. And it's probably about 1 kilometer long and from east to west. And you can enter this back alley. And the back alley is probably about 1.5 car lanes worth of size. No cars drive up there, but it's probably about 1.5 car lanes wide, maybe even 2. And the way you access this back alley, which has all the bars and some restaurants, is you can go to the beginning or the end of the alley and enter and then walk all the way through, or you can cut up through these very small mini alleys that are sloped where the crowd crush would eventually take place. So the first time I went to Itaewon, Halloween was back in 2012, and there was not a lot of people there at all. It was okay, but it wasn't anything grand. And I had left Korea for a bit, and I came back in 2016, but didn't end up going to Itaewon again until 2017 for that Halloween, for those Halloween festivities. Now, during this time period, because I guess Western culture was kind of becoming more popular, or Koreans were becoming more adventurous, more and more Koreans started going to Itaewon, and Itaewon started changing to something that was more trendy. Originally Itaewon was kind of, it wasn't a bright area, to put it nicely. It was a little bit, almost a little bit sleazy. It was a little bit dark. It was a little bit dirty. It felt at the time back in Korea is a very safe country in terms of crime, but back in 2012, it felt like if there were a crime to take place, it felt like it would happen there. But through the increased interest and increased trendiness, it started experiencing gentrification. So a whole bunch of new shops came in, which pushed out the old shops. Like almost all the Western bars that used to be popular started disappearing. Like if you've been to Korea, or if you're an old timer here, like things like Seoul Pub, those all disappeared in place of trendier places. And more Koreans started coming to Itaewon. And I would say that Koreans will still say that Itaewon is the foreigner area, but I think it's because they aren't a lot of the people, especially if they're older now that don't go out, Itaewon is not a place for foreigners anymore. I mean, during the day, you'll see a lot of Africans and Arabs because there's the biggest mosque in Seoul is around the area. And a lot of the teachers moved or lived near the neighboring area, Haebangchon. But even that is kind of like the old generation of foreigners. You know, originally foreigners came to Korea. Maybe they had a specific reason, like I did. I was familiar with Korean culture and had friends here and whatnot. But a lot of people used to come to Korea just because it just seemed kind of exotic, or, you know, oh, everyone was going to Japan to teach. I'm going to come to Korea, something like that. So there wasn't really any strong desire for it to be specifically Korea. Now, all that has changed recently with BTS and K-pop taking foot in the West. And now the new generation of foreigners, they come here specifically because they, you know, love Korea through its media. They love K-pop, they love Korean drama, they're predominantly female. They want to date a Korean guy. So, and most of the foreigners that come now are in Hongdae, which is kind of one of the big college areas. So the nightlife is over 90% Korean, I would say. Anyhow, in 2017, when I visited there, it was mayhem. I wanted to walk through the entire back alley at least once, so I didn't enter through one of the smaller sloped entrances. I went from one end and walked all across to the other end, and the entire back alley was just a massive line. Just imagine you're in a massive line trying to get out of a subway station or trying to get out of a stadium. It was that kind of feeling, except just pretty much down a street. So you didn't even bother to try to go into a bar or a club or anything, because if the street was that packed, then of course you wouldn't be allowed. I mean, you probably wouldn't even be able to get into a bar or a club. That would already be completely full. And even if it wasn't completely full and you were allowed to enter, imagine trying to get a drink. It would take forever. So my point in all this is, even in 2017, it was way too crowded. And it wasn't even fun, to be honest. And that's why from that year I vowed that I'm kind of done going, because it's just not, there's so many people, it's not even fun anymore. There's no point. But I went that year with a friend, and I told the friend, I said, this is not sustainable. They can't run it like this anymore. I thought to myself, I'm from LA. If anyone's from LA or has visited LA, they have a Halloween parade every year. It's not really a parade. It's more of kind of like a street party where they shut down, this is in West Hollywood, they shut down Santa Monica Boulevard. And Santa Monica Boulevard is about, 4 lanes of traffic each way. So we're talking about almost 8, assuming it's a little less than that, 8 lanes of traffic for people to wander around on the street. They have enough space. I mean, arguably, even if they shut down the main roads of Itaewon, there wouldn't have been enough room. But they would have to at least do that in order to continue having this event, because it's not even an event to accommodate the amount of people going there, because it was just way over capacity. So that was 2017. I don't know how 2019 looked. However, in 2020 and 2021, there was COVID, so there was no Halloween, or there were a lot of cops there preventing people from doing anything, because the previous government was very cautious, so to say, on preventing the spread of COVID. So they really they really wanted to make sure no one was out partying, or, to make sure that the COVID numbers did not spread. So by the time 2022 came along, the kind of mask restrictions were lifted and people were allowed to go party again. So I guess just the hype of not being able to party for 2 years, people were super keen and super excited to go out. And again, out of the list of places to go, Itaewon is one of them for Halloween. But again, it is not an event, and over 100,000 people showed up to Itaewon, and they went into the back alley, and you guys kind of know the rest. And I didn't go that night. I had a friend contact me, and he said, "Oh, where are you? What's going on?" I'm like, "What are you talking about? I'm in bed right now." And he was sending me videos, and it was just absolutely crazy. I went to bed that night thinking that probably 10 to 20 people would probably die. Of course, if even one death is a tragedy, but waking up to see what the number was, which was at that time around 150, the final death count is 159 people from a neighborhood that's, that I've been to many times, that's just kind of down the street for me. I heard ambulances go by. It was about 2 kilometers away. It was just very surreal and very shocking. So it begs the question of whose fault is it? Now, I immediately thought that it would be kind of the that district. Seoul is broken up into different districts. Itaewon is in the Yongsan district. I figure it would have been the responsibility of the Yongsan district to have people there to have organized it. It turns out it was the cops' fault, obviously, as well. They had received phone calls throughout the night, as early as 6:30 p.m. saying that, hey, there's too many people, you need to come do something. The cops didn't do anything, and it wasn't until after 10, when the crowd crush had started, did emergency personnel start to show up. And it was just an absolute disaster. There's way too many people there. They weren't letting some of the emergency personnel through because they thought those were just regular people wearing costumes. There was so much traffic that ambulances couldn't get in. The ambulances were, they're coming from many different hospitals. So logistically, they was just like they were coming in, other ambulances were going out. They were, they were carrying deceased people to the hospital, even though there were people that still needed to be saved. It was just an absolute shit show. I was debating whether to use that word or not to get censored on YouTube, but who cares, whatever. It was an absolute shit show. So obviously this happened. At first, people were very shocked and very saddened, and then people started pointing fingers. What the hell happened? How could this have happened? And ultimately, it really looked bad for the police, because not only did they not show up when they started receiving calls around 6 p.m., but also, Halloween isn't just a one-day festivity. People start, especially if it's on the weekend, people start celebrating this. Halloween's on the 31st. This particular event, disaster happened on the 29th, which was a Saturday. People start partying on Fridays as well. So on the 28th, there were also a lot of people in Itaewon. There were fights that were breaking out. People were it was essentially the same exact thing that happened on the 29th, except not as many people. And obviously the crowd crush didn't happen, but there were people falling over. There were arguments. There were actual fights. It was chaos. And it came out later throughout the investigation that actually the cops had a safety analysis that was done about the area, and in the safety analysis, which was done 3 days before the event on October 26th, they found that they estimated that a lot of people were going to go to Itaewon, and that there would need to be a suitable amount of police officers there. Now, to be fair, in the report, at least what the news reported on, they really only talked about crowds kind of flowing out into the streets, into traffic, and potential cars hitting each other, and also just overall kind of traffic. So, which is enough reason to have police out there, of course. However, it didn't specifically mention that there would be the possibility of this crowd crush. And unfortunately, it takes a disaster or tragedy to know that it's possible for it to happen, and that applies to a lot of things. And I think it's just something with the human brain. I mean, take the 4-minute mile, for example, or the 4-minute 1.6 kilometer for all you metric system people. Before that barrier was broken, people thought it was impossible for humans to run a 4-minute mile. So nobody really, because they didn't think it was possible, no one tried. But once it was proven that a human can run a 4-minute mile, at that point, more people tried to do it and more people accomplished it. How that relates to a disaster is, when a disaster hasn't happened yet, you don't really think of the possibility, or maybe my smart listeners do, but in general, people don't think about the possibility of it happening. So they don't really pay any attention to it. So, and anytime a disaster happens, there are new laws that get created. So, for example, after the Titanic sank, there were new laws that stated, there has to be enough lifeboats for the amount of passengers on the ship. Nowadays, that seems like common sense, but up until the Titanic sank, that just wasn't common practice. So, because something like this hadn't happened before in Korea, I think there was a stampede in the 1950s or whatnot, but anything on this caliber where so many people in one spot and this crowd crush happening hadn't really happened. So nobody really paid attention to it. Now, that is not an excuse. I'm not excusing the behavior of the district office, the police officers. They have definitely failed in doing their job. My point is, we need to try to understand this from a broader lens to kind of get into the minds of what they were thinking, because we already know that they screwed up. But the next question is, how could this happen? How could they let this happen? So this is kind of going to the psychology of, how people could have let this happen. The other thing is, even if the district office, so the main problem is it's not an event. It's not a festival. It's nothing. It's just people going to a small street where there are bars. So typically, if there was an event that had an organizer, then that organizer would be responsible for having security and having, getting licenses from the government and having the required police presence there for traffic control and all this. So because it wasn't actually an event, there was no one really in charge of doing this. And unfortunately, because of how polarized the political situation is in Korea, I think that, I think a couple of things. One, I think that even if the Yongsan district did say, okay, even though it's never been done before, we're going to do it, I think they would have been attacked by the opposition party. I think they would have been blamed for wasting government resources on a Korean culture-related event. They say, oh, why are you shutting down traffic and wasting taxpayer dollars to host this event where it's not even celebrating Korean culture? I think that even though this was 2022 and mask restrictions were lifted, because of all of the fear and propaganda that had gone into how bad COVID was in 2020 and 2021, there were people that, felt that it was still too early for the mask mandates to be lifted. So they would have blamed the district office for hosting this massive party, which increased the numbers of COVID. And that's just the kind of the sad reality of the, and that's not unique to Korea. I mean, I think anywhere where the politics are polarized, you'll have that aspect of it. But one aspect that is kind of related to Korea, and Japan might be included in this as well, is kind of it's never been done before, so we're not going to do it kind of attitude, or we can't even fathom doing it. There's I tell this story a lot. I'm not sure if I've told it on this channel before, definitely not on this podcast, but essentially a couple of years ago, I went to a franchised cafe that sells coffee, and they had paninis, and they had a jalapeno cheese panini, and they had a tomato panini. Now, both paninis were made fresh, fresh to order, at the cafes, and both paninis cost exactly the same price. So let's just say $5. So I really, I like tomatoes, I like jalapenos, and I wanted a jalapeno tomato panini. So what would be, I requested, can I have a jalapeno tomato panini? Now what do you think would the response would be? Well, I thought, okay, the panini is $5. So give me 50% of the tomato you would normally give me if I got the tomato panini, and 50% of the jalapenos that you would give me if I got the jalapeno panini, and put it together. So it's not very hard, it's very simple. But because there is no such thing in the manual as a jalapeno tomato panini, it just can't be done. That it's just as simple as that. It's not in the manual. It hasn't been done. It's very easy to do. All we do is put a little bit of tomato, a little bit of jalapeno. No, it can't get done, and that's part of the culture. It's just that it hasn't been done before. We're not gonna do it. So now, obviously, it's a tragic event. A lot of people were upset with the government. About 70%, the people were polled. 70% said they did not think the government did a good job with handling the disaster. However, there were some people that thought that it was the people's fault. It's not, obviously the police, firefighters, whatever, could have done a better job of rescuing people or even preventing the event from happening. But there are some people that say, you know what? Those people decided to go out and drink. Those people decided to enter that small street. It's kind of, it's sad, but it's kind of their fault, kind of a victim blaming. And although it's never good to victim blame, of course, but it does help to know what situations put us in danger in order to prevent us from putting ourselves in those situations. So if I'm, rocking a gold chain or Rolex or whatever, and I'm walking down the street, a neighborhood that I know to be dangerous at night, and I get robbed, yes, it's my right to walk down any street at night. Yes, it is illegal to steal from other people, but it's kind of like, okay, at the same time, if I don't want to be robbed, I shouldn't be walking down the street at night with any valuable possessions. Or I shouldn't be walking down the street at all if it's dangerous. But if I do, I shouldn't be with the valuable possessions. Now, same thing. Let's say I go to I'm not going to use a female wearing suggestive clothing in the next example because I'll get canceled immediately, and I don't want to deal with that. So let's say I'm wearing. I plan to go to a gay bar, and I'm wearing extremely short shorts. Very suggestive short shorts. Maybe they have like a kiss on each butt cheek. I don't know. Anyway, I go into the gay bar wearing these shorts, and then a gay guy slaps my ass. And I didn't want that. And it's like, yes, going somewhere and having your ass slapped is sexual harassment, and it is against the law, and it shouldn't be done. However, I am going to a gay bar wearing clothes suggesting that I'm gay, also clothes suggesting that that's the kind of behavior that I would like, considering of how short the shorts are. So if I don't want my ass to be slapped, of course, I could hope that the people there obey the law and I won't run into any issues, just like I could hope no one who's going to rob me going down this dangerous street. Or I could take my own preventative measures and wear more appropriate clothing, or not even go to the bar in the first place. So I think that was the added, and I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. I'm giving you an explanation of how people think. So that is how some people thought about the incident. Like, those people chose to go there. It's actually their fault. But at the end of the day, we shouldn't be relying on the government to protect us. Of course, having a government that will protect us and having a government that provides safety might seem like a good idea. At the end of the day, we want to be responsible for our own safety, and we should, the person that is most responsible for our own well-being is ourselves. So this whole incident, I was trying to, wrap my head around, and something clicked with me one day. This was 2 years ago, about a month or two after the event. I was speaking to a buddy of mine. He is a high-level person at an oil refinery in Korea, an engineer. So he manages part of the oil refinery, and he has a team of 200 people. He's managing a big operation. And he said something that was really intriguing to me. He said, it's very easy to get the workers to follow safety protocols while they're working at the oil refinery. That's not a problem. But what's really difficult for us is to get them to follow safety habits, good safety habits in their personal life. And I was like, what? So they follow the rules of safety at the plant, but there are more accidents when they're off of work. It was mind-boggling, and it hit me that Korea does not have a strong culture for safety. It's kind of ironic. One of the safest countries in the world has people that don't care about safety. So there's actually something, there's a word in Korean for this. It's 안전불감증, which means safety apathy. Safety apathy, which kind of goes into just the fact that people don't really care about safety. They don't. And which is kind of ironic, again, because Korea is one of the safest countries in the world. But I mean, if you visit Korea or you live here and you walk around Seoul, you can see countless I can't overestimate how many examples you can see of this. It's staggering. There are people that are, they're walking down the street, watching a movie or television on their phone with their headphones on, or they're doing that same exact action but walking down a flight of stairs. Or there are people who, as soon as the light turns green to cross the street, they don't even bother looking before they cross the street, assuming that the person driving is not going to run the red light, even though that happens all the time, that they're not going to run the red light and hit them. There are people cars that when they turn right, their only purpose is to make sure that no cars are coming perpendicular so they can safely turn right instead of worrying about the people in the crosswalk. There are people that look one way. They're looking, let's say they're walking down the street, they're looking to the right because something had caught their eye, and they'll continue walking. But they won't be kind of looking to the right, and their peripheral vision will be kind of diagonal so they can see whatever they want to look at to the right and look straight ahead. They are dedicated to looking right, and they are looking right and walking straight, and they have no idea where they're walking. There are old people that like to walk backwards up a hill. Apparently it's good exercise, but instead of walking backwards up the hill, turning their head around their shoulder to make sure no one's behind them, they'll just walk up the hill regardless if there's anyone behind them or not. Even today, there were 2 incidences where safety wasn't an issue. I was walking my dog, and next to a child's park, there's a small little parking lot, and I was walking across the parking lot, and a car just turned on. He saw me. There was no visibility issues. He turned on the car despite me and my dog being almost right in front of his car, and immediately took off. If I had been paying the same amount of attention to him as he was to me, my dog and I would be hit. Once we got to the park, there were 2 joggers that were behind me. The joggers were fine. They were coming up. I heard them jogging. I turned to my left. They jogged. They went right by. A guy up ahead sitting, he was on his phone. He stood up. Without looking. He stood up, walked into the middle of the walking path, almost into the runners. The runners had to run around him. And I can go on and on and on. There are people that they're watching movies while driving. My buddy said that his wife doesn't wear her seatbelts in the car. And it's not. I've been in those situations where I've been the driver, and someone will get in the car and I'll say, hey, put on your seatbelt. Like, no, I trust your driving. It's not about trusting my driving. What if I have a heart attack or a stroke all of a sudden and I lose control of the vehicle? What if you're driving under a bridge and some kid throws a rock into the windshield, and these 2 examples might seem kind of extreme, but these things have happened before. Or what if I'm just not as good of a driver as you thought and I got into an accident? Or the riskiest situation, which is I'm a good driver, we're stopped at a light, the person behind me is watching or texting someone on their phone, and they rear end us. And then when I found out, I said, what about the kids? She makes the kids wear seatbelts, right? She says, yeah, when they're on the highway, they wear a seatbelt. But when we're driving in the city under 40 kilometers per hour, and we don't have them wear a seatbelt. These kids are not wearing a seatbelt if they're driving this. It is just mind-boggling. The other day, I was walking around the corner at the park, but there, even though it was a corner, you can still see around it. It wasn't like a wall. It was just a small little ledge, and I saw a woman walking right towards me, and I saw her walking towards me. And I said to myself, let me see how this is gonna play out. And I already knew how it was gonna play out. We were walking. I see her turn the corner. She walks right in front of me. And, she's absolutely flabbergasted that my dog and I haven't appeared in front of her. And the only reason I mention this example is because it happens so many times where I'll be walking down the street and I'll see someone 50 meters ahead of me, and we're walking closer and closer towards each other. And I've been looking at this guy for 50 meters, and there's plenty of opportunities for him to see me within the 50 meters, and he doesn't know I'm in front of him until we're less a meter away, and he's shocked that a dog has suddenly appeared, and a person walk. I'm not calling myself a dog. A dog and his owner has suddenly appeared. I can go on, but you get the point. There is just not a strong culture of safety in Korea, and I think that is ultimately the crux of the situation. So I'm not taking blame away from the district. I think the people at the district's office are to blame. I think a lot of the police, not police officers, but the head of the police who were supposed to have cops there, they are to blame. But if you think, how could this have happened? It's not because, okay, so what you might hear is you'll hear this was a couple of months after the current president, Yoon Suk-yeol, who's conservative, he became president, and he moved the blue. I have a video about why, moving the blue house is actually a good thing, but he decided not to stay at the Blue House, which is the Korean equivalent of the White House. He decided to move the previous he decided to move the operations of the Blue House to where the Department of Defense used to be in Yongsan. So there were arguments saying that, the reason why there weren't enough police officers in Itaewon was because the police officers were outside of the presidential office trying to keep an eye on all of the protesters to avoid any situation from occurring. And if the president didn't move the Blue House to there would be less police required for managing the protests, because the Blue House area is that you can't really protest around there, and therefore the excess police officers would be assigned to Itaewon. And I think so that'll be one thing that they'll attack. Then that's why they wanted to attack. That's why they wanted to attack President Yoon. Now, even though I originally supported Yoon, I've come to not like him so much. But then we could play that. We can play the what if game countless times. What if it rained that day and less people wanted to go out? Then there would be less. This might not have happened. And although that situation you might say isn't really applicable because we can't control the weather, one thing we can control is what if people weren't protesting so much? And I'm not saying that people don't have a right to protest, but a lot of these protests are not genuine reasons that, he'd only been in office for a few months. A lot of the protests weren't the fact that he had done something terrible over a couple of years and they really wanted him out. A lot of the protests were just because he was conservative and of the opposite party. And I'm not saying that only the leftist party does this. Both parties are guilty of doing this, but both parties will have protests just for the sake of having protest. So, once we get into if he didn't move the Blue House, it wouldn't have happened. I think you can easily say, well, if the opposition didn't protest for the sake of having their candidate lose, then there would have been more police officers in Itaewon as well. Now, I do believe if I had to have an explanation for why the top police officers were adamant about having people around the protest instead of at Itaewon, I would imagine that it was, if I had to guess, it was probably because they wanted to give off a good impression that they had everything under control in order to get some promotion or to be in good favor with the government, the ruling party. At a later time, it was probably for own selfish political reasons. That has not come out officially. We don't know that. I'm just saying that if I had to guess. However, again, I think that the main thing is they truly didn't know that this could happen. like because they in their mind they didn't think, they have no concern or very little concern for safety, they being the police officers, is that they just couldn't fathom this would happen. So I think the same goes for the parents of the victims. Obviously they want retribution, they want heads to roll. Ultimately, only a few people got jail time. Like 2 or 3 people got jail time. It was only about a year and 2 months. Ultimately, it was because the law didn't, because this is an unorganized event, it's very hard to put the responsibility on any group. The police officers do have the right to, the duty to protect the public, but because this event wasn't, this wasn't an event, so there was no organizer, there was no real main person that they could put the blame on. Also, in the Seoul City Safety Plan guide, this is not the analysis that I was mentioning earlier, in the Seoul City Planning, they took a bottom-up approach, which essentially meant that they asked the public in a democratic fashion, they asked the public what their biggest concerns were and put more of a focus on that. And the only time anything related to a crowd crush came up was related to overcrowding at subway stations. And even that was a low priority. But an emergency situation involving a crowd crush was so low that they weren't prepared and they didn't have a plan for it. Now, of course, similar to what happened after the Titanic sank and after what happened with the Sewol ferry accident, there are now currently new laws and regulations pertaining to safety regarding large crowds. So, the goal is for this to never happen again. Obviously, never say never. Now that this has happened once, and there are that we know that it's capable of happening, the government knows and the public knows that it's capable of happening, they'll do their best to prevent it doesn't happen again. There are other major, like the fireworks festival, they took extra careful steps to make sure there were no issues with crowd crushes or anything. So ultimately, I guess my final point is, yes, we can protect the safety of workers by having safety protocols at work, or we can protect the public from certain instances from creating laws that require certain mandates or certain police presence, and those are all good. But ultimately, when we have a culture that doesn't care about safety, or that does not put safety first, we can prevent accidents that have already happened. But when there's a gap, when there's something unforeseeable that we haven't thought of, if there's no culture of safety, those accidents are bound to happen, which is why we need to have a culture of safety. And that is the missing piece that I have felt that nobody has talked about. And I hope that if you had been following this story from when it happened 2 years ago, and you just really couldn't understand at all how something like this could have happened without having experience in Korea, hopefully this background information can help you figure things out or understand things more appropriately. That's all I have for you today on this episode, guys. Thank you for watching or listening, and I will catch you guys next time.